Good group to join, trust me. Well, this is our annual dinner, and it's awesome, as you can tell. The church does a great job. I want to thank them. Our latest newsletter is out. You can actually find that at ScituateHistoricalSociety.org. We also did print a few that are up front if you don't have a computer, which is, I'm sure some people don't. The schoolhouse is now open. We took a break in January. Also, the Maritime Irish Marching Museum is open Sundays again. We invite you to stop by and see what we have. Some cool stuff. We have a couple of projects that we're working on. I think you were aware of the lighthouse, maybe? We're also doing the Scituate over. So it looks like it's going to be a pretty busy year. We have an event coming up on March 2nd. And it's going to be, actually it's February 18th. It's the James Webb Space Telescope. We actually have NASA coming down to talk about it, which is pretty cool. That's a pretty amazing thing. And then on March 2nd, does anyone here know who Matt Brown is? He's going to do Scituate trivia at the GAR. And I'm sure it's going to be a hoot. Don't wear masks. Let's see. Also, we have a couple of Scituate High School students here that are in the Scituate program. J.D. Willis and Connor Driscoll. So tonight, our guest speaker is Don Wilding, and he at the start of the millennium, Don has been telling stories of Cape Cod Outer Beach history. An award-winning author and editor of Massachusetts newspapers for 36 years. Don is the author of several books on Cape Cod history, Shipwrecks on Cape Cod, which he told me there was between 3,000 to 4,000 of them. A Brief History of Eastham, Henry Beston's Cape Cod. Tonight he's going to speak on his latest book, which is Cape Cod and the Portland Gale. And if you're interested, on May 20th, his newest book, Historic Storms of Cape Cod, will be released. He's worked as a tour guide, leads history walks for the Harwich Conservation Trust at the Cape Cod National Seashore, and he is pretty much, he's got a very big resume, and we're just tickled pink to have him. So I'm going to turn it over to Don.
All right, and thank you for having me here tonight, and wanted to talk to you tonight about a storm that many here at Scituate are pretty familiar with, from what I've found. The storm did its share of damage here, and it's all pretty well documented. What I did a few years ago, started putting together this book, Cape Cod and the Portland Gale of 1898. This past November marks the 125th anniversary of that storm. And for those of you not familiar with the storm, the Portland Gale, and how intense it actually was, if you experienced the blizzard of 78, all right, well, imagine that without any kind of, really, the warnings were not really there for the Portland Gale. Certainly not like they are today. And the destruction that it caused on the Cape was just incredible. How bad was it? A week after the storm hit, the Boston Post put it this way: it was a night to try men's souls. It was a night when the strongest of men trembled and when women wept. It was a night that should witness deeds of human bravery. It was a night of agony and of death. It was a night when the Coast Guardsman was remembered. So looking back on shipwrecks, we were just talking about all the shipwrecks that happened on Cape Cod, but nationwide during the fiscal year of 1897, before the storm hit, nationwide there were 394 disasters, maritime disasters. And just during the Portland Gale storm of the weekend of November 26th and 27th of 1898, there were 187 wrecks. So that's a pretty staggering percentage right there. And these are the headlines that started coming in gradually. They didn't have the immediate access to news reports that they have today. They only came out in the newspapers, really, and it was several days that these statistics finally were coming in. And you see the Portland Daily Press there, loss of the Portland, and all-day search for bodies from the Portland. This was the Boston Post talking about the Cape. And then there was this newspaper from San Francisco that said 99 lives go out with wrecking of the Portland. That number would just increase. I also noticed that the subhead here, they said steamship dashed to pieces on the rocky shore of Cape Cod, which tells me that the editor writing that headline had never been to Cape Cod. So the impact of that storm is, it was one of those, nowadays we always talk about the blizzard of 78. The storm comes along and you might say, oh, well, nothing like the blizzard of 78. Well, it's kind of the same way, it was the same way with the Portland. For many years, that one set the bar. There were, 30 years after the storm, the keeper of the Wood End Lighthouse in Provincetown, his name was Douglas Shepard, he said there were many old-timers left who are still willing and eager to settle down and begin their story. It was in '98 when the Portland went down. So the Portland, that's how the storm got its name. It really had nothing to do so much with Portland, Maine. Yeah, Portland, Maine felt the storm, but it's the impact of what happened here. 192 lives were lost aboard the steamer Portland, which left Boston on that night of November 26th. They refer to it as the Titanic of New England in many cases. At sea, there were 456 lives lost off the Atlantic, the northeast coast during that storm. So the Portland, beautiful, luxurious steamship that regularly ran between Boston and Portland, Maine. There was another twin vessel called the Bay State that also ran, owned by the Portland Steam Packet Company. And these two would kind of go back and forth between the two cities. One would be going from Boston to Portland, and the other one would be going from the other way around. So the Portland that night was headed from Boston to its namesake city in Maine. And this was Thanksgiving weekend. So you had a lot of people who were going home from the holidays, celebrating the holidays in Boston, heading back to Maine. Well, these people would not make it. There were no survivors that night. This was the interior. This was inside Portland. Looks like something out of what you might have seen from the Titanic. Beautiful looking place, luxurious staterooms. That night they were really packing them in too, because it's either the steamships or the railroad. That was the way. That was the methods of transportation in those days. You weren't flying or doing anything else. That was the way you traveled. So they were packing in as many as they could on this particular night. So you had close to 200 people. This is a map that was in the papers over the course of the following week after the disaster. Now, what had happened with the Portland was they left Boston at 7 p.m. as this storm was hitting, just getting ready to hit. Headed towards Portland, well, it never made it up to Portland. Sometime after 9 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night, it started to drift out to sea, caught up in this hurricane-force storm, and then drifted out over Massachusetts Bay, and then eventually ended up, they thought originally it had run aground off of Truro, but it proved that that was not the case. It went down over Stellwagen Bank. Its remains now sit in 460 feet of water. So these were the weather reports that started coming in during the course of Saturday, and this was pretty much the only places people could get the weather forecast. You know, look in the paper that morning. Not the way they update it now every half an hour or whatever it seems like they do. But these were the reports that were coming in from the Weather Bureau. And Captain Hollis Blanchard of the Portland. Now, he gets a bad rap for this whole disaster, but was it his fault? That's the question a lot of people ask. He had recently been promoted to captain. He had been with the company for a long time. And he had gotten warnings from about this incoming weather system that was coming in from the Midwest area. But that didn't stop him from his appointed run that night. There was also always, there's this pressuring never to cancel a passage that he would get if there was a chance to make one, so they would not lose the line's prestige, passenger fares to the railroad. You know, they didn't want that, the delay in freight delivery. That was also a business that was going on with the Portland as well. They were not only delivering people, they were delivering freight. Blanchard was convinced he could beat the storm up to Portland. He didn't know how bad it was going to be. I don't think anybody completely realized how bad it was going to be. Blanchard was actually a frequent visitor to the Weather Bureau office in Boston. And in fact, in the past, he had been called out by his superiors for being too careful. So he may have taken his chance because he felt pressured to do it. They actually called him on the carpet about it. And so was he pressured to do it? Well, as soon as the disaster happened, the company they blamed him. They said, oh, he went against our orders. And then they started asking all the other captains of other boats and vessels in the Boston area about it, and they all knew Blanchard, and they said that's not true. They said Blanchard was very careful, and you know, there was no way that they were pressuring him, if anything. So what was Blanchard getting himself into? A storm that was way worse than they thought, because there was a storm coming in from the Midwest. There was also one coming up the coast. So they collided right off south of Nantucket. You had that, what they like to call now, bombogenesis. The storm just explodes. And you had 90-mile-an-hour wind gusts out in Truro. And there were 100-mile-an-hour wind gusts, too, in other places on the Cape. Joshua James at the Point Allerton station up in Hull estimated visibility at sea was about 100 yards. So you really can't navigate any kind of vessel if you can only see 100 yards. Within 2 hours of the start of that storm, 200 vessels from Maine to Martha's Vineyard were scrambling for some kind of safe harbor from the storm. So the Portland is heading north and couldn't shelter anywhere along the North Shore. It was also, there were eyewitnesses that had said, oh, it looked like the Portland had lost part of its superstructure, that it had lost its power, and that it was even starting to fall apart as it was getting tossed around by this hurricane that had kicked up very quickly. And a lot of people reasoned, well, maybe he's trying to reach Provincetown Harbor also. Might be the only chance that he has. He wouldn't have had much luck there either, as I'll tell you later. By Sunday morning, though, there were reports of the Portland maybe was being spotted off of Cape Cod. Daybreak, Sunday morning on the 27th, Sam Fisher was the keeper of the Race Point life-saving station out in Provincetown. He heard from close offshore these bells and whistle blasts, 4 whistle blasts, believed to be the Portlands. You know, he seemed to know what the Portland would sound like, what it would look like. He didn't see anything, but from what he heard, he thought there was it definitely could be the Portland in distress. So he started getting his crew together, with their lifeboat and everything, their surf boat. No dice, they weren't able to even get it off, wouldn't have been able to get the boat out into the water because it was so, the surf was so tough. So, and this was also when the eye of the storm, this storm developed an eye as it was passing over the Cape. So there was actually a bit of a break there, and that's when he heard those blasts. Another storm that had an eye as it passed over the Cape, a winter storm, the blizzard of '78. So both of these storms had developed that kind of shape. There was also a fishing boat called the Ruth Martin. Michael Hogan was the captain. They were trying to get back to Provincetown after fishing out there right before the storm hit, and Hogan and his crew said they saw a large side-wheeled steamer, and they said they were sure it was the Portland, but they couldn't be, they couldn't prove it. And they said it was in view for a couple of hours before the storm kicked in again, and they couldn't see it. It disappeared from sight. And then there was the story of the three-masted schooner, the Mary A. Tyler, which was sailing from Maine to New York. And the captain, Alan Bragg, and there's a lot more I'll tell you about him later, but he said later on, he somehow survived this storm. And as his own ship was being tossed around and battered in Cape Cod Bay, or right around the area of Cape Cod Bay, he said he passed so close to the Portland that he could touch it. He could have touched it, but he couldn't provide any help. So at 7:30 on Sunday night, a surfman named John Johnson at the Race Point Station recovers a life preserver that has these letters on it, STR Portland, while he was out on patrol. And within the next few hours, more debris from the Portland comes washing in with the tide. And then finally at 2:20 a.m. on Monday morning, November 28th, they discovered the first body near the High Head Life Saving Station in Truro. And then at Cahoon Hollow and Wellfleet, another body from the Portland's crew is recovered. And over the next few hours, more bodies start coming ashore. Many bodies and pieces of wreckage came ashore at Nauset, down in the area of Eastham and Orleans and Chatham. Tales were still being told of the carting of bodies to the railroad station, relatives waiting anxiously in the Cape towns for the loved ones to be released from the angry seas. And any of the bodies that came ashore and had watches on them, this is the time that was on there. It wasn't certain as to whether it was AM or PM even. But everybody, their watches read anywhere from the area of 9:15 to about 10 o'clock. This is a list the Eastham Historical Society had of some of the victims that had washed ashore in Eastham. In a total of 38 bodies washed ashore on the Cape. Those were the only bodies that were found from the Portland. So there was another nearly 160 some odd bodies that were not accounted for. To this day, they've never been found. And a few days after I had written a column for the Cape Codder newspaper back in 2015 about Portland. And a few days later, I got an email from this gentleman, Rick Lindholm in Eastham, and he had told me his great-grandmother talked about the Portland when he was a young kid. And she would tell him about the bodies they found on the beach in Eastham, and the funeral home on Bridge Road in South Eastham was full, and that the ground was frozen. So they kept a lot of the bodies in the barn that was next door, because they had to keep them there. And the situation with the bodies became really tough. Also, I mentioned there were no survivors, but this story did circulate after, during the recovery phase after the storm, that a surfman in Orleans, or perhaps Eastham, I believe it was, the Nauset Station's lifesaver, was searching for bodies, and he walks along the beach and he sees a body laying there by the water. Well, he goes over, turns the body over, the man's alive, as the story goes here, okay? It says the story, he said that he turned it over, and the man looked up, his eyes opened, and he said, and he saw the guy started to run, the lifesaver started to run to get help. And the guy laying on the ground there, the victim, is, for God's sake, don't leave me. Well, he does. He leaves, runs to get help, comes back, the guy's dead. So, if it's true, and I kind of find it hard to believe, that because, think about it for a minute, this guy would have known what happened with, what actually happened with the Portland. Nobody really knows. There's a lot of theories, but nobody has anything concrete. But this guy could have told them if he wasn't alive. But that was the case. He was not, and they couldn't really find anything. If he had, the ship went down over Scituate Bank. So if he had, excuse me, if he had somehow survived and made it all the way from Scituate Bank, which is 20 miles north of Provincetown, down to Eastham, it's a long way, about 30, that's at least 40 miles. In the water, he would have died of hypothermia easily, and it was said the guy was a good swimmer. Not that good. So anyway, that was the story that came out of there. In March 1899, a few months later, there was a fishing schooner called the Maud S. Now, the Maud S had actually spotted the Portland on that night in November of 1898, off the North Shore. And they were thinking they were one of the many boats where the captain was thinking to himself, what is Hollis Blanchard thinking, going out in this storm? Well, he was, they were one of the boats that spotted the Portland off the North Shore, and during this particular instance, they were out over Scituate Bank, and they pulled up some of the parts of wreckage in their trawls, which proved to be the, oh, thank you. They pulled all this wreckage up in their nets and everything that, and they determined that the people from the company said, yes, that is from the Portland. So this kind of got buried over the years, though. This newspaper, there were newspaper articles and everything about it. But people seem to have forgotten about it all these years. Oh, big question about the Portland. And then you had all those years of Edward Rowe Snow searching for it. He never found it. Snow did have a big hand in putting together a group called the Portland Associates, which were the families of the victims of the Portland, who would be on the Cape every year for many years afterwards. Also had a lot to do with getting this plaque that was put up at Highland Light in Truro. If you ever go to that lighthouse there, you can see that plaque. And eventually the relatives also all passed on eventually, and the organization was dissolved after that. The Portland itself was finally located in 1989 in 460 feet of water in the Scituate Bank National Marine Sanctuary. Note those words, National Marine Sanctuary. It means you can't touch it. So they found where it was. They found that old 1899 newspaper article. John Fish and H. Arnold Carr from the New England Historical Maritime Group from Bourne, they actually found all these, the location, and eventually these images, several images were taken over the years. In 2002, and later on, many more were taken of the Portland. Debris on the deck of the vessel. They never found any human remains, though. Of course, they can't go inside it either. So, and diving would be extremely, there have been divers going down, but going that deep, very dangerous. So meanwhile, on the rest of the Cape, this had a big impact on the entire Cape, because the word spread pretty quickly in a variety of ways around the Cape. People on the Cape knew more about it than anybody else did in New England. And in Provincetown, it was described, the whole thing was described by a young woman named Annie Newcomb. She was 15, and she wrote this composition. She wrote, "Men who had vessels which were expected to be unfit for further use as they were being driven ashore were crying. Women who had relatives out at sea were weeping, and children were crying for fear of being washed away." That's how devastating the storm was. One of the most heroic efforts during the storm happened in Provincetown, out in the area near Wood End. That's the very tip of Provincetown. This is about in the area where the Pilgrims actually anchored, the Mayflower anchored many years earlier. And the Wood End Station life-saving crew, led by its keeper Isaac Fisher, they had the ordeal of having to try to reach two vessels that were in trouble just out in the harbor. And if you were to do this on an ordinary day, it wouldn't take very long, maybe an hour or two, at most, to get from the Wood End Station into a boat and out into the water. Well, this is a harbor that was being filled with about 36 ships that were just being thrown around like toys, and there were two of them that had people on board who were trapped. The Lester A. Lewis and the Jordan Mott. Both of them were from Maine. And Fisher and his crew had to pull a surfboat through snow, and it was on a barrier beach. So they also had to go through breaks in the beach because the water had come through. You had 50-foot wide channels. So they had to try to get this through too. And they had to pull the surfboat without the aid of a cart that they usually used, because if they put it up on the cart, the wind would have blown it over. That's how extreme the wind gusts were. So they had to do this, and just to get it to a point where they could get it in the water, because there was all this debris and everything floating around in the water. This is just out in the that West End area of Provincetown, where the breakwater goes across out to the beach. So this particular area, where they took 10 hours just to reach these men that were on these two vessels. 5-man crews on each one of them. And by that night, 6 of the 10 men had frozen to death. This was a fate that happened quite a bit on shipwrecks in really cold nor'easters. And so the Mott was already sunk to its upper works. The captain and the ship's cabin boy, they were nearly dead. And their companions actually had to keep beating on them to keep them from freezing. And Captain Dyer's father, who was the steward of the vessel, he was already dead. His body was encrusted with snow. And the lifesavers took off the 4 survivors. The Lester A. Lewis, meanwhile, had only its deck house and masts above the water. 4 men in the rigging were all dead. No signs of life. What they would do on a shipwreck, whenever a ship got wrecked and was half in the water or whatever, they would often climb into the masts to try to hope for somebody to come along and save them. Well, these guys weren't so lucky. And then there was another one who was in the cabin, which had no roof on it, and he was also frozen to death. And so they took the survivors off and left them, the dead men on there, and eventually they were removed, and that was a couple of days later. And there was a woman that was identified as Mrs. Henry Spears by the local paper, and she watched from her windows. She was living on the harbor, and the men were cutting frozen bodies out of the Jordan Mott's rigging. And from that time on, it was said she kept her shades drawn on every window that was facing the harbor. Meanwhile, on the back shore of Provincetown, there was a schooner called the Albert L. Butler that had hit what they called the Peak and Hill bars. It's an area of sandbars off of that back shore of Provincetown. It extends out almost a mile, or at least it did in those days. Very treacherous area, a lot of shipwrecks happened there. And the Butler was caught up in the storm. They were carrying logwood from Jamaica to Boston, got driven ashore. They were they weren't too far offshore, actually. So this enabled, they were only 50 yards away, which is actually pretty close for a shipwreck. And so the lifesavers get there, and they had these surfboat ready, and also their apparatus, which included the breeches buoy. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what a breeches buoy is. It's used in a nutshell. See this little cannon here? That was used with a projectile and a box full of rope that could go up to, I think, 500 yards or something like that. They would fire this onto the mast so that the people on board, if they're so able to do so, tie it up, and it creates this zip line between the shore and the boat. So they actually are lucky enough to get this shot out there. But one of the men grabs it on board the Butler, and he doesn't know what to do with it. So he just grabs the rope and jumps in the water. Instead of doing what he's supposed to do, get inside, there's actually like a pair of pants you step into, and you actually get a ride across the water. Well, he didn't know to do that. He's dragged through the water. He actually makes it. And then two of his other crewmates tried that. They weren't so lucky. 20-foot waves saw to that. They didn't make it. They got swept away. Well, later on, as things calmed down, two more men come out. They had been hiding in the cabin all along. They made it. They appeared on the deck and just stepped down and walked back onto shore because the tide had gone out enough. And one of them walks up. He's got a big parrot on his shoulder, right out of a pirate movie kind of thing. And apparently the bird had quite a salty vocabulary, but he was also repeating a lot of things he was hearing, and the guy said, "That bird's got it right." He said, "That storm was a real humdinger." So meanwhile, Provincetown has its own problems with ships being thrown around the harbor. Same thing happened in Martha's Vineyard, in Vineyard Haven. Tossed like toys was the description. 50 coasters being thrown around the harbor in Vineyard Haven. Half of them washed ashore, 10 men drowned, and a British schooner was driven into the wharf near the Seamen's Bell. They also had two lime schooners from Maine. Now, one thing I did not know until I started researching for this book, the mineral lime, when it gets wet, it ignites, burns, catches fire. That's what happened to these two vessels as they were being thrown around the harbor. So these poor crew members are in real distress. One of them was being thrown around so much, and it's catching fire, and the crew members are deciding, what do we do? Do we burn or do we drown? So as they're being thrown around, another ship gets thrown right in their way. They're practically colliding. And these guys make the daring move to jump off the burning ship onto the other ship, and they made it. They were lucky. And the life-saving service, these guys had to go through during this storm. It was just incredible. They were described as men who worked like fiends, and the sand cut their faces until they were raw and bleeding, because these guys had to go out in the storm. You might know this from walking on the beach just in the summertime on a windy day. You know, bare legs, and you got the sand blowing against your legs. Oh, that hurts a little bit. Well, imagine the 90-mile-an-hour wind blowing the sand in your face. Well, what it does to you, it cuts your face until it's raw and bleeding. That's what happened to them. They would come back with blood running down their faces. It was like a swept sharp, fine sand through the air and smothering streaks that cut like the strokes of a whiplash, was the description. And the lifesavers, they were exhausted. after a whole week of this, trying to cover their beach. Some of them were completely unnerved by it, having nervous breakdowns, dragging these torn and sea-washed bodies from the surf. What happens to a body when it's actually in the surf for a while? Pretty gruesome. I did describe it in the book. But it's what the elements can do is really pretty cruel. And these men were nervous wrecks from pulling these disfigured and figures out of the ocean. One of them, Ben Eldridge, he described it as a terrible week that we spent. Sometimes we could just see a hand sticking up in the sand, and when we dug, we exposed the body. And one of the lifesavers' duties was to transport the bodies to the proper authorities for burial after they found them. So a reporter asked one of the Beacon Hill lifesavers about it, and he told him gruesome details of finds he had made and the method of carrying the dead to the station. And then he was asked if it wasn't rather hard on the nerves, and he answered, we can't think about that. They're someone's friends. So they had put the job first. And a week later, the Boston Sunday Post paid tribute to them. Heroes of the storm. 300 souls were lost on that awful night, but you did your best. You are the heroes of the blizzard. Some of you toiled all night alone. Some of you walked up and down those wreck-strewn beaches. Some manned the boats. Some succored the saved at the station houses. All are heroes. So, meanwhile, then you have the media, which in those days was pretty much the newspapers. They were the ones who had to break the story. Story of a couple of these reporters who had to go above and beyond. One of them was a reporter for the Boston Herald. He was a correspondent, really, for the Herald out on the Cape in Chatham. His name was Charles Ward. Ward had picked up a telegraph message from Highland Light after the storm, and nobody really knew what had happened with the Portland. There were a lot of rumors going around, but nobody knew. Well, he had gotten this telegraph message that the Portland was gone. And, it was a disaster. Everybody was dead. And Ward takes this message. He can't call it in because all the lines are down. So how does he get it? Well, he's got to get on a train. He had to get a special work train that only took him as far as Sandwich because a lot of the railroad tracks had been torn up by incoming tides along the base side of the Cape there. These huge tides that had come in and just torn up the tracks. So he manages to get to East Sandwich, and then he goes into town, into Sandwich, knocks on a guy's door, borrows his horse. This is the middle of the night. Borrows the horse, rides the horse to Buzzards Bay. This is before the bridges. So there he catches another train that takes him to Boston. He's sitting with another reporter. He tells him nothing. They're talking, making reporters small talk. And he tells him nothing about his scoop. And as they're getting to Boston, well, he runs up the steps to the Herald office, delivers the news to his editor. He's not even telling other people in the office until he gets to the editor. He gets in, tells the editor what had happened, and then he passes out. Well, the editor gets a few belts of whiskey into him, wakes him up, and they get the story. Herald breaks with special edition. Ward made himself a nifty $500, which was a pretty good paycheck in those days, and he had broken the story about the Portland and that it was gone. Kind of changed the game. So during the week that followed, another storm kicks in. After they finally fixed a lot of things on the Cape, railroad tracks, phone lines, well, this other storm just set them back, more down lines. So a lot of the reporters are hanging out. They've kind of made their headquarters at this house in Orleans called the Shattuck House. And they're just basically sitting around having a bunch of drinks and doing nothing because they feel like, okay, we can't do anything with the phone lines down, let's party. So while they're there in this place, Frank Stanion of the Boston Globe, is figuring out, he's got names of victims. Nobody else has done this yet. He's figuring out, how am I gonna get this into Boston? So he's gotta get creative. And he had to use a pretty unusual relay system. He heads out back into the snow. He's walking around in Orleans, and he passes by this one building where he could hear the click of a telegraph key. And obviously he's out in what's now Route 28. He went in finding out it was indeed a telegraph station, the French cable station in Orleans. And he goes up, and he goes inside, and they weren't doing a lot of business that day because their own telegraph line into New York is down. That's failing. The superintendent there, Hugh Osborne, an Englishman, welcomes him inside, and they said, well, let's see what we can do for you. And they finally figure out a way. Osborne sends the message from Orleans on the Cape to St. Pierre and Miquelon, these two islands off the coast of Newfoundland, which are actually French possessions. They played a prominent role in prohibition and rum running, but that's another story. That was sent from there under the on the Atlantic cable to France, and from France to London, and from London via British Postal Service to Ireland, and roughly 2,500 miles back to Nova Scotia, and then down the coast of New England to Boston. That's how we got it in. And the media too was trying to now capitalize on anything they could. Word had come in about the Portland. They sent two towboats out to Provincetown from Boston, filled with reporters. All at once, they descended on the town, and they would talk to anybody who had anything to say, just so they could get a story, get some kind of story on the disaster. There were only 2 hotels in town at the time, and they were both full at that point. And a lot of reporters, too, hired horse and carriage teams for transportation. Especially when they had to go out over the dunes to those life-saving stations in Provincetown and Truro. There was one of the reporters went into one of the undertaker's rooms in Provincetown and saw what was the body of a 50-year-old woman. She was described as having a cruel cut on her head, evidently caused by the contact with a piece of wreckage when she was in the water after the ship had broken up. And the reporter also said these tales were sickening and painful to listen to. We could not but shudder at the terrific tales of this horrible storm. And the railroad. Big breaks in the railroad in both Truro and Sandwich kind of shut off railroad service to the Cape for several days. And a lot of people were coming, too, from Maine. Many were searching for days, trying to find any news of what had happened to their loved ones. They were checking in at the undertaker's room. Some were walking the beaches with the life-saving service, surfmen, anywhere they could possibly get an answer. And a lot of them left without answers after a while. So but this was the scene in Truro. If you can make out this little cartoon, they actually had to get little stagecoaches to ferry the people back and forth from one end of the break in the tracks to the other. And this was the scene in Sandwich, between Sandwich and Sagamore. 3 to 4 miles of track were washed out. Also in West Barnstable, there was more washed out. It was reported that a tidal wave crossed the railroad track. Now we know that is storm surge. Covered parts of Main Street in Sandwich with 3 to 4 feet of water. Several fish houses were wrecked, one of them being stranded on the railroad track. This is downtown Sandwich. Had all kinds of buildings being damaged, all kinds of trees were taken down. This building here with the roof taken off, Daniel Webster Inn in Sandwich. A lot of Cape Mariners went to sea that night. Some returned, some didn't. One of them that didn't was Captain John Garfield of West Dennis. And only a few nights earlier, him and another friend of his, Captain Mark Holmes of New Haven, they were dining together in Philadelphia. They had become pretty good friends over the years. They were about to embark on yet another coal run. This was their business, transporting coal on their ships to New England ports. And 96 hours later, they were together once again, only not in a manner that anyone had expected. Both were lashed to the masts of their respective ships, dead, at the bottom of the ocean off Montauk Point, New York. Garfield, he was 36 years old. He was the captain of the three-masted schooner James B. Pace. And Holmes was also the captain of the Howard M. Hanscom. And these two vessels would often sail together on their runs. They were both being loaded with coal on November 24th. Garfield and the Pace for Boston. Holmes and the Hanscom were going to Providence. And the fate of these two ships remained a mystery for over a year. December 1898 edition of the New York Maritime Register reported the Pace as overdue, followed by several months of missing status. Garfield had a wife and two children back in West Dennis. The first mate, Danny Nickerson, his wife had an 8-month-old son in Dennisport. Days and weeks passed, the optimism was starting to fade for them returning home. And then in December of 1899, government divers who were, quote, investigating navigational obstructions at the bottom of the seas off Montauk Point discovered the Pace and the Hanscom. It was said that in both vessels, the divers report the skeletons of men were found lashed to the rigging or to the rails of the vessels. And while there's nothing left of the flesh, it's thought they can be recognized by the clothing. The only way they were able to tell. And then there were survivors. You've all heard the term wash ashore when it comes to Cape Codders. For those of you not familiar with the term, it's if you wash ashore, it means you basically you were not born on the Cape, you moved there. But there were also people who really did wash ashore and stayed there. I got a few of those stories. But for the Portland Gale, you've got the story of Captain Alan Bragg, who I mentioned earlier. He actually lived to tell his tale. He was captain of the Mary A. Tyler and was carrying a load of paper from Maine to New York, broke in two and stranded near Paynes Creek in Brewster. Bragg was a native of North Carolina. Yes, he was related to Fort Bragg, yes, same family. And his crew took to the rigging after his ship had broken in half out in Cape Cod Bay. And it ended up near Paynes Creek. They were rescued by a Brewster captain named Jeremiah Wixon and a bunch of other volunteers from town. His daughter described this to the Brewster Historical Society in 1971. She said that grimly he and his men worked to keep their own ship afloat. Just before night fell, as the terrifically high and pounding waters off Cape Cod, his boat broke in two, the forecastle remaining just enough above water to allow the men to try, but in vain, to light a blaze, however small, for warmth, by pouring kerosene on coal. They had a few water-soaked soda crackers, but they were too frozen and sick to eat. They tied themselves together with a rope, and after hours of struggling with the wind and the icy deck, managed to lash themselves to the mast. All during the frozen night of horror, the wind whipped the mast into the sea, tossing it up and down, as though it were more than a splinter, freezing them to it. Their clothes were iced to their bodies, they were vomiting and nearly unconscious. The wind abated somewhat toward morning, and after daybreak they were sighted from shore. And it paid off in the long run for the town of Brewster in a lot of ways. Captain Bragg told his daughter also that for a long, long time, the tides brought in rolls of paper from his wrecked ship, which the natives gathered, dried, and used. It was said that the Brewster school newspaper had been printed on that for many, many years. And turns out that Bragg married the daughter of his rescuer a few years later. Bragg married Margaret Wixon, Jeremiah Wixon's daughter, and they stayed there for the rest of their lives. And his life at sea didn't end with the 1898 Gale. During World War I, he was a lieutenant commander for the Navy, led some of the largest transports of the war. During World War II, he worked for the government as a civilian in charge of a Michigan shipyard which built small boats. And his memory now lives on at the Captain's Golf Course in Brewster, for all you golfers out there, where the second hole on the starboard course is named for him. So a lot of debris came ashore, and one of the things that came ashore in Orleans was one of the double wheels in the steamer of the port. And this was found by this old Cape Cod salt named Rufus Snow. And Rufus Snow took this steering wheel. It actually had 200 feet of cable attached to it. He would take it around. He would exhibit it in Boston, and then took it up to Maine, where it was promptly seized by the Portland Steamship Company. They destroyed it because it hurt their business. So a couple of other stories too, and these happen more around here in this area, in the South Shore, but they involve Cape Codders. There was the Varuna. Now, you're probably also, you might be familiar with the pilot boat Columbia, which wrecked off of Scituate during the storm. The Varuna was its sister vessel. And, I didn't lay that out properly, but the Varuna ended up in the marshes of East Barnstable following the storm, and many people thought it was done for. But imagine the surprise of the fellow mariners in Boston Harbor when it was towed back to Lewis Wharf by the steamer Philadelphia on November 29th. The Varuna left Boston as the storm hit on November 26th. It managed to stay offshore near Highland Light. The mainsail was torn, a lot of things carried away, the cabin was flooded, and one of the canoes was damaged, but they were able to fix that and get to the Philadelphian, which happened to be passing by, and that was 30 miles east of the Cape, and they were towed back to Boston to safety. The Murtis Perry also went stranded on the beach just north of the Brant Rock life-saving station. And after the Perry struck the beach, the foremast swung in such a way that the 10 men were able to just jump right off onto the beach. Convenient enough for them. Boy, this did not work. Looked fine when I laid it out. Anyway, it was owned by Frank Perry of Brewster. Murtis Perry was his daughter. They had a crew of 14. They were carrying 15,000 pounds of fish. And they'd been out in the open ocean, did really well, and headed back for Boston, and then the storm kicked in, and they were forced to hit the beach anywhere they could, and they finally ended up doing so, and they did lose a few of their crew members. And then there were a lot of wrecks that happened right in Boston Harbor. Cape Codders ended up being rescued in Boston Harbor, right near Boston Light. The three-masted schooner Calvin F. Baker, that was captained by J. Parker McGafflin of West Dennis, struck a submerged ledge in the back of Little Brewster Island. And over the next 2.5 days, 3 men of the crew of 8 were lost. They were out calling for help, and it was written that the mother of one of the assistant keepers was so affected by the shock of hearing these frozen men calling for aid that throughout the day that and the following night that she died very shortly afterwards. And the Point Allerton lifesavers finally got a tugboat to the scene. One of the 5 out of the 5 survivors, McGafflin was about the only one not far gone. The scene was one no eyes wished to dwell upon. The lifesavers were quickly handed, they got these men, who were, many of them were half alive, back onto the surf boat. And I'll leave you with a couple of other short stories here, back to the Outer Cape. Back to the body recovery, this is out of New Orleans. A young fella named Clarence Rogers was out walking the beach shortly after the storm. He spotted the body on the beach. And Rogers is on Nauset Beach. And he finds this young lady about his age. Clarence is about 20 years old, maybe. And he finds this young lady, she's wearing the body of this woman. She's wearing only a white nightgown and a black stocking, which is actually more than some of the victims were wearing. And he's absolutely stunned by this. He covers up the body with his coat, and then he runs back into town, which is a few miles away, to the local undertaker's office. And the undertaker gets his card out there. Clarence rides along with him. And it was said, for some strange reason, perhaps because the victim was so near his own age, perhaps because the discovery had been his, the happening for him held a horrible fascination. So back at the undertaker's office, the officials are scrambling to figure out who this girl is. A casket was chosen by Clarence. And they said, well, if that's the way youth sees it, why not? And that was their reasoning for accepting his choice. Well, finally, relatives from Maine show up to claim the body, and they didn't like the casket choice. They chose another one. And throughout the winter, Clarence would stop by the undertaker's office on occasion to regretfully view the casket. And later that winter, Clarence got sick, came down with a cold, and then eventually became pneumonia. And it wasn't long before he died. And following his death, they had to choose a casket. And they all agreed that the coffin he had selected for the young victim of the wreck was the most appropriate one in which to bury him. So he was put in a tomb, according to the newspaper reports, in the cemetery in Orleans. And for many days afterwards, the family dog would show up and just lie down outside the door of the tomb, waiting for his master to wake up. This went on apparently for several days. And finally, the poem, The Lost of the Steamer Portland, written by Captain Frederick Eldridge and hydrographer George Eldridge of Chatham, no relation. 326-word poem opened with the lines, on the 27th of November in the year of 98, a northeast blizzard swept the sea, death following in its wake. So that summer, it became, by the summertime, it had become a song. They had music to it. And it ended up having quite an impact on a visitor from New York, E.W. Blanchard, brother of Hollis Blanchard, captain of Portland. He was staying at the Monomoyek Inn in Chatham. Blanchard drove around town with George Eldridge. Eldridge would sing to him the song of the Portland, which, according to the Chatham Monitor, affected Blanchard very much. And back to Annie Newcomb and her composition again. She found some pretty appropriate words to describe the impact made by the storm. The terrible event which rested so heavily on the hearts of many and which will not soon depart. So I want to thank you for having me. Just a little warning too, storm watch for May 20th, my next book. Historic Storms of Cape Cod. That's my fifth book. This will feature all the storms that came after the Portland Gale and how they affected Cape Cod. Hurricanes of 38, 44, and 54, the blizzard 78, the 87 storm, the perfect storm, Hurricane Bob, just to name a few. And yes, I have copies of my book, Cape Cod, with Gale up here for sale. Afterwards, I do take money as well. You can pick them up. Are you ready? Yeah. They weren't very suitable. Afterwards, they weren't using those paddle steamers on the ocean much afterwards. The Portland Steam Packet Company was cleared because it was a storm, and when it happened afterwards was ruled an act of God by the courts. But it wasn't long before the Portland Steam Packet Company was actually sold and kind of phased out the use of these ships on the open ocean. I think they kind of saw the error of their ways. Yes, probably better off just keeping those things on the rivers. Plus other forms of transportation, I think we're starting to come into more use at that point. So, yeah, they probably figured out not a good idea. I will be up here for a bit.